Well, good morning, everybody. My name's Robin Kemp, and I'm here to talk about principles and skills in holding difficult conversations. So you're very welcome to this webinar. My session aims to support you to be better able to prepare, to stay centred and ethical in your conversations, to communicate as well as you possibly can, and to learn, to keep learning and to develop. Hi, I'm Robin, as you might guess. This is a picture of me in Aberdeen, which is where I was born. I'm a proud Scot, although you can't tell by my accent because we moved around every 5 years or so. I started working in social care for children in the 1980s. I went into my first children's home and actually got really sucked in by that bug in the 1980s. In the mid-1990s, I qualified as a social worker, went back to manage residential childcare. And in the noughties, I discovered this thing called social pedagogy, which has been something that I'm very, very stricken by, and I think is very useful for social work practice as well as its own discipline. So I'm a independent consultant and trainer and have been for the past 10, 11, 12 years. I chair the Social Pedagogy Professional Association. I am a mum, a single mum of 2 grown-up kids living in the East End for quite a long time now. I particularly love music, a very good North London football team. I really like snooker. I used to live in Sheffield. I am Scottish, so I love Scotland. And most recently, I love failing at arts and crafts projects. It's one of my new things that I've learned during the lockdown, and I'm really fascinated by humans and what makes us human and how we communicate in particular. And now I'm particularly interested in birds too. So that's just a little bit about me. So what is conversation? The Cambridge English Dictionary, I used to live in Cambridge, so I thought I'll use that dictionary, defines it as an informal, usually private talk in which 2 or more people exchange thoughts, feelings, or ideas, or in which news or information is given or discussed. So it's about an exchange. In social work conversations, I think there's a particularly interesting thing about whether we give information or we share information. And even when we are telling somebody some news, we really need to make it a 2-way exchange. So this is kind of basis of today's webinar. So what makes conversations difficult is all sorts of things. Conversations are a bit of a minefield. There are a few things up here on the slide here. Misinterpretations are hugely responsible for difficulties in conversations. When we don't prepare, we have difficulties. The topic can be very difficult. Unconscious bias and processes, body language, tone of voice, organizational systemic influences, distractions, private or personal influences. Technology in this day and age can also be problematic. When people have very fixed views, power and not using it appropriately, judgment, blame, emotional states, the place that you're in, the venue, communication style, there's all sorts of different things that make conversation difficult. So where do we start? We start with being prepared. So being prepared is a really important aspect of having these conversations. We need to be self-aware and contextually aware in order to really make the most of the conversation. Social constructivism is an underpinning theory for social work and social pedagogy. It's a sociological theory of knowledge, which is about human development being socially situated, and that's where we construct knowledge. We construct knowledge through interactions with other people. So we don't see the world as it is, but as we are, which means that all our perspectives are different. Heinz von Förster was a social constructivist who said a few things of great help and import. Things like, it's the hearer, not the speaker, who determines the meaning of what is said. That means that we really need to be thinking about how somebody else is going to interpret what we're communicating. And how they have understood is part of the conversation that we need to have. He also says reality only emerges through dialogue, which means that our reality and somebody else's reality may not be the same until it happened. Truth is the invention of a liar. How can these statements help you in your preparation? Coming back to now, who are we and how do we construct the world? That social constructivism really helps us to think about these ideas of what does the other person's world look like? How does it feel to them? If truth is the invention of a liar, that's just one to get your juices going. It means that we need to be really cautious about our own fixed views about what the truth is. We also need to be really cautious about how other people see the truth. So getting to dialogue is how we can find a shared reality. We are incredibly influenced by an enormous amount of things in the world. We're aware of a lot of our influences and we're not aware of a significant amount of influence. There's a relatively new field of social research in communication theory called automaticity. And this is about the control of one's internal psychological processes by external stimuli and events in one's immediate environment, often without knowledge or awareness of such control, despite our good intentions. There's been a huge amount of research around this because it's so interesting. They did some research with a parole board in the States, and they found that in the morning, people were granted parole in the morning, and then as it came to lunchtime, you were less and less likely to get parole. And then after lunch, then they were more likely to get parole. But by the end of the afternoon, by about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the chances of you being granted parole were really, really low. And this is because people were massively influenced by hunger and fatigue. We become less empathic and more into meeting our own needs when we are tired and hungry. So that's one influence that we might not be aware of, and certainly this parole board wasn't aware of until the research showed it. Part of the automaticity research also shows us that minor threats to our self-esteem lead us to stereotype. That's just a minor threat to our self-esteem. And if you think about yourself and the other party, who I'll be referring to throughout this, this is one of the things that we really need to be aware of. We are massively influenced by the societal, political, socio-economic and cultural arena that we're in. We cannot deny the massive impact that poverty has on children and families. So These are things that are hugely important, and if we're not aware of those, if we're not taking them into consideration, we can cause difficulties in our conversations inadvertently. We're also massively influenced by the institutional frameworks that we work within and the way that the organisation works. So institutional frameworks like time frames might be influencing how we approach particular conversations. We will be influenced by the way that our leaders and managers want us to do things. Will be influenced by how the regulatory framework also wants us to do things. The local community, so where you are, North London, how does that influence what's going on in the conversation? So there are so many things that will influence us. We need to really make sure that we are aware of those, which means that we need to be up to date with law and policy and the what's happening to the most marginalised in our society. Sadly, we have rather lazy brains. Brains are very complicated things. And what we are designed to do is actually take the path of least resistance. So what we tend to do is we tend to have a belief, and it's rather like a furrow that we plough. We plough a furrow and we stick our beliefs in there. And what our lazy brains do is we manipulate information to fit our belief system. And as social workers, we need to be really critical and analytic about that, because we assign our own perceptions and interpretations, self-image, values, importance of our experiences to a situation. And we really need to be conscious that sometimes our beliefs will not be a true thing. One thing we might be finding something is very difficult in a moment, and the trigger of uncomfortable emotions and the stress that we feel will make us even poorer at communicating. So we need to really know what's influencing us in that moment. Self-awareness and relational work is absolutely key. Harry Ferguson, who's a very fine professor of social work and has been writing about relationship-based practice for a very long time, talks about it involving 4 key components for social work practice. We need to be reliable. Social workers are known for turning up late often. So we need to really think about how can we be totally reliable. We need to immerse ourselves in the day-to-day existence of service users, and we need to be helping them to develop their life skills. We need to get physically as well as emotionally close to service users. This is quite a tall order, actually, but in some circumstances. But both the physical and the emotional closeness really helps to support our clients. And we need to be practicing critically in ethical ways that take account of power relations and structural inequalities, using good authority. That sounds quite succinct, but it's also deeply complicated, very, very complicated. So what can help us with that? It's really complicated because we bring 3 people with us. We bring the professional person with us into our professional situations. We bring our personality, we bring who we are into that relationship. And we also bring the private stuff, the stuff that we would rather keep out of our professional and personal relationships. So we need to be conscious that the private is something that we don't want to have in our practice, but it will always be there because it's part of who we are. This is something from social pedagogy, and it was one of the things that really made me think this is a very helpful theory, because in social work practice, we tend to be taught that it is not professional to bring the personal into that professional relationship. Relationship-based practice would argue that actually, if we don't bring who we are into the relationship, then we are not being human. And how can we develop an authentic and helping relationship with someone if we don't bring in who we are? I think to add the third private P to this, professional and personal, helps us to manage those different areas, and it helps us to keep the private out of the professional relationship and boundaried. Because in the private, we are subjective, we are partial, we're using knowledge from our own experience that have not necessarily been well processed. It's about what happens in the moment. We pursue our own agenda when we're talking from the private place, and we're not meeting anybody's needs but our own. In the professional and in the personal, these are very different. In the professional, the basis for our interaction is professionalism. In the personal, the basis for our interaction is purpose related. We need to try and be as impartial and objective as we can. In the professional, we're using knowledge from theory, research, law, local policy, regulations, all that kind of thing. In the personal, we're using processed experience, our own processed experiences and our self-awareness. If we share anything from our own life story, we must be prepared for it to be out in the public domain. We must be prepared for it to be thrown back in our faces at another stage. And we must be prepared for it to be something that other people might use against us. So this is why we only really want to use very well processed experiences in our own lives. Our actions need to be characterized or influenced by, in the professional, analysis, chosen methods and theories, and our evaluation of the situation. In the personal, our actions are characterized by empathy, by an immediate understanding of the situation. And our approach to collaboration must be disciplinary and multidisciplinary in the professional, and we must really be cautious and conscious about making sure that we are upholding the rights of individuals, their rights to participate, their rights, their human rights, and for children's rights need to be upheld and promoted. And in the personal, we have to be willing and eager to cooperate. So this is really about how do we have those conversations in a cooperative kind of a way, and we'll go on to that in a moment. The needs that are being met when we are in the professional are other people's needs. In the personal, it's the others, but also a little bit of your own, because this is a relationship. These are two-way things. So be conscious of what you're bringing into the conversation from the professional, the personal, and be conscious of what the private is about. So in preparing ourselves, we also need to consider the power dynamics. This is something from Salman Rushdie from a long time ago that I developed a little bit. But he talks about discrimination as being a combination of prejudice and power. And as social workers, we have a great deal of power. We also all have our own prejudices. We have our own values. We make our own assumptions about life. We stereotype in particular ways. We use particular language. We have particular behaviours that we find acceptable and some that we will not find acceptable. We might have, our prejudices might be based on information or misinformation that we've received over our lifetime. We might have an individual experience that leads us to be prejudiced about a particular group of people or a particular situation. We might have a sense of a perceived threat. And when we have all of these things and we combine them with our power to act or to not act, to intervene, to justify, make decisions, to judge or blame, we run the risk of discrimination. So we really need to be really conscious about what our own prejudices are in order to be able to ameliorate for them and to not let them come from our private into the professional and personal relationships. Think about what assumptions are you making about the other party's intention? So how do we act in an anti-discriminatory way? We need to be open. We need to combine openness and power. So we need to be open to new information, to new learning. This one, I think, is particularly important. We need to be accommodating a range of perspectives alongside your own. This kind of relates to what Janet is saying. We might not be able to sympathize because we don't have the same experience as other people, but we need to be able to accommodate a range of different perspectives alongside our own. Our way is one way, other people's ways is their way. That needs to be an okay thing. We need to make and own our mistakes. Mistakes are a way of learning. They're okay. Sometimes they can be catastrophic. We want to try and avoid making as many mistakes as we can, but we do make them. See them as a learning opportunity. And sometimes we need to let go of old ideas. And when we combine that with empathy, curiosity, our ability to act or sometimes not act, to intervene, to clarify, mediate, explain, advocate, then we're working much more in a way that can be described as an anti-discriminatory. So one of the things that I think is really helpful and useful for holding difficult conversations is to consider what kind of discrimination has the other party experienced. Just try and think about that before you were even in that conversation, because how they've experienced abuses of power will have an impact on how they see the relationship between you as their social worker and them who has a lot of power, and them who probably feel quite powerless. So I would argue that we need to hold our power lightly. If we hold on to it really strongly and solidly, then we're not going to be able to share it. And this is a really important part of it. We need to be committed to learning about different client groups, thinking about how our own reflection, our own self-awareness can help us to develop and to have meaningful conversations that make a relevant change and adjustment in somebody's life, and to use theory and research in practice. We need to really think about our values, demonstrate and develop empathy with different client groups. So how can your values then really support different client groups, and recognizing that our own perspectives can be influenced by our prejudices. We also then need to develop skills, and sometimes we need to both learn and unlearn. So we need to continuously develop our relational communication and our critical analysis skills. We need to keep this balance going. It's very, very important for these conversations. So the third part of preparation is keeping an open mind. And the theory of mentalization, there's a reference here after a few slides from Ostergaard Hallquist, who's a Danish psychologist who's worked with Peter Fonagy, who's the kind of author of mentalization. But Jana talks about keeping an open mind, and how we do that is with these 5 kind of areas, and I would call them values too. We want to try and keep a balance between in the conversation, a balance between who has the space to express their views, balance in terms of power, balance in terms of emotion. So keeping your own internal balance is really important. The more curious we are, the more helpful we are to the conversation. Keeping patient is also a very important one. Sometimes it can be extraordinarily difficult to keep patience when somebody is really not getting what you're saying. But try and center yourself, keep that balance, maintain your patience. Being open to a range of different perspectives, being open to a range of different explanations, being open to as much as you possibly can will help that other person to feel that you get them. And that's really important. And finally, but I would perhaps say most importantly, empathize. Try and stand in those people's shoes for a moment. Try and think about their lives and what's led them to this position, this particular point in their life. Try and empathize with where they might be in that moment. Empathy is a vitally important aspect of mentalizing. So what is mentalizing? It's an imaginative activity about others and me. It's an ability to think about or reflect on mental states in oneself and in others, to think about behavior in terms of underlying mental states. Behavior is communication. Appreciate others' thoughts and feelings may be different from our own. Be curious and reflect on possible differences between yourself and the other persons. And then try and understand misunderstandings. So mentalizing is basically seeing ourselves from the outside and others from the inside. And when we are mentalizing, we're looking at particularly 5 different areas. What are the reasons for this conversation? What are the reasons somebody's engaging in this conversation with you? What are your reasons for the conversation? What are the thoughts, feelings, needs, and goals for you and for the other person? It's about trying to connect with your life worlds. So you're trying to connect into the other person's world so that you can communicate as appropriately as possible with that person. But when we're in the moment, it's really difficult when the emotional intensity is high to do that kind of mentalizing practice. When mentalizing, when the emotional intensity is high, what we can be is supportive and empathic. That's why empathy really is something that we need to keep developing in ourselves. Interestingly, the University of Michigan has been surveying its students for the last 70 or so years, maybe longer. And what they found is that in the last 30 years or so, 20 to 30 years, there has been a 40% drop in empathy. Now, this is a student body. We might take the results of this with maybe a modicum of salt there. But even so, what it indicates is that as Western societies, our levels of empathy have been dropping. So in order to really think about this in terms of social work practice, this is something we do need to rehearse and practice. what is empathy? How do we stand in somebody else's shoes? How do we support somebody empathically? Because in a high state of emotional intensity, we're not really able to do much in the way of mentalizing. But as that emotional intensity drops, then we can start to do more. We can clarify, we can elaborate, we can start to challenge. And then we can start to a bit of basic mentalizing. So what are the thoughts and feelings going on in my head and in somebody else's? And then as the emotional intensity really drops, we can start to mentalize the relationship between us. Mentalizing is a really helpful way, I think, of empathizing and getting into the shoes of somebody else, and perhaps to immersing ourselves into the day-to-day existence of other users, of service users. So we'd also now need to think about preparing the other party and ourselves. The why, the how, and the what. Why are we having this conversation? How can I best support this conversation and the other party? And what do I aim to achieve? Why? Clarify the purpose. Why are we here? What's your mandate for being in this conversation? Social work works along this kind of continuum, doesn't it? It works between the free will of the service user and force. So where we make the decisions through courts and the law. And what we want to really be clear about is where upon this line we're at. What is the purpose of this conversation? You need to be really clear about what your aims are. What's the purpose? What's the aims? And think about what aims and values might you share, because we've got to try and find where there might be some common ground. But for the other person, they might well be asking the same questions, and it's important for us to think about what might they be thinking. They might well be thinking, what's the hidden agenda? You get a knock at your door and it's a social worker. Most people immediately think that they come to take your children. So there's often a thought that there is a hidden agenda. So how can you ameliorate for that? How can you deal with that in the conversation? Being really clear about your purpose will really help. How can we create the best conditions for this conversation? I think of it rather like gardening, in that we want to create the best conditions for this conversation to grow. So what can you do to the soil? How can you get the best, most rich kind of soil in there? I put a few things in there, but the physical environment, where are you? Are you at the office? When we invite people to the office, that can often be interpreted as a power move. So how are you going to deal with the power dynamic there in terms of them coming to your place? Or if you're going to their house, how can you use that environment to the best ability that you have? Are you culturally aware and sensitive to the family? Have you got a way of supporting a range of different emotional states and of calming the situation? We need to come in as calm, and we need to try and leave calmly. So what are the important values that you can take into the conversation? For me, I think that's one of the best things that I've learned recently is When things are difficult, I try and think of the three most important values to keep in my mind throughout the conversation. So think about the language that you're using. Also think about whether the other person has any language needs. Maybe you need to get an interpreter. Are you being age and stage appropriate in your communication? Have you got enough time? A lot of the criticisms of social work practice is that social workers are really hurried, that we're rushed. We're not present in the moment because we're thinking about the next visit or we're worried about something else. So it's really important to really try and make sure that you can be present in that moment. And then how? How are you going to have the conversation? Well, I'd say rehearse, practice, practice, practice. The more we practice, the better we're going to be at dealing with the unexpected that comes up in a conversation. How you might be wanting to ask yourself some questions. How could the other party respond to me when I'm telling them this news or I'm broaching this conversation? Why am I here? Why am I here? You've got to think about a number of different ways of articulating that. How could they be feeling? You want to try and prepare yourself for a range of different emotions. You might be seeing some anger, but where the anger might be the surface emotion, what other emotions might be underneath that? The surface emotions are a bit like an iceberg. There's a huge amount more that's going on if we could only see. How will you support them to have a conversation where they feel they can equally actively contribute? What will they want from this conversation? How do I support a respectful and helpful relationship between us? The more that we have the quality of relationship in our minds, the more that will come through in the conversation. And how do you cope with your own emotions? What are you going to do if you suddenly have an emotion like fear, like anger, like upset? Maybe you feel upset. How you cope with your own emotions in the moment. So there's something about guessing, making some educated guesses about this conversation. You don't need to spend a huge amount preparing, but you do need to prepare yourself for a variety of eventualities that might occur in that conversation. Because if they don't happen in that conversation, your preparation will help for another conversation. We can never prepare enough. And then the what. Clarify our aims and desired outcomes. So think about how your aims and your outcomes might be misinterpreted, because you'll need to think about how to say this in a number of different ways. The same message in a number of different ways is what really helps for the other party to embed what you're saying. So if you're just repeating things in the same way, then it can sound that can also sound like we're losing patience with people. So think about a variety of different ways of exploring and explaining what you're aiming to get out of it. Think about how the other party can contribute to or shape the aims for this conversation. Or is this your agenda only? I would argue that in most cases, there's always some room for negotiation, for some room for a contribution to allow the other person to shape the conversation, to guide and direct it to some degree, can really, really help your relationship. Think about what the positive and negative consequences for the relationship, what they could be. If you're imparting some really difficult to hear news, yes, it might have a negative impact on your relationship. So are there any little things that you can do to ameliorate for that. Sometimes we want big stuff, but actually it's little things that matter. So in your preparation, think about some of those little things. And then how will you develop the quality of your relationship during this conversation? Remember, it's the hearer, not the speaker, who determines the meaning of what is said. So the more that you can clarify and acknowledge what people are saying, the more likely it is that you will be able to build trust through this relationship. The more trusting the relationship, the more likely we are that the help we offer will be accepted. So we really need to think about that. And then communicating and keeping centered. So how do you communicate and how do you develop your communication response? There's a lovely quote from George Bernard Shaw here. The problem with communication is the illusion that it has been accomplished. It is difficult. It's well tricky. Actually, you're probably familiar with the communication cake. We communicate massively through our body language and tone of voice, and really the words that we speak will have less and less significance depending on the tone of voice and body language that matches. So we need to make sure that our body language and our tone of voice are congruent with what we're saying. Do not underestimate how your body language, and this is where the private can often come out in our tone of voice and our body language, even though that our head is telling us we're keeping the private out. Our body language and tone of voice can really speak very many more volumes. So let's just have a little look at some communication theory. This one is by somebody called Frederick Schultz von Thun. And this came as a result of a lot of long-standing research into communication. And it's a really helpful theory. It says that in every message we send, there's not just one message, there are four. And every message we send has four potential other messages. And they're also received in four different ways. So there is the factual information, there's an appeal, there's the relationship, and there's something about ourselves in a communication. Communication is a bit of a minefield. So what do I mean by that? Okay, so here we go. Factual information, the bin is full. Is the bin full? Well, again, that's actually a matter for interpretation. I would argue that when my children were teenagers, the image on the left there would still not be full because they'd still be able to get something in there. So actually, this person is saying the bin is full. So that is the information. That's the factual information that person sends. They might have any one of these messages also going on at the same time. Their message might be, please empty the bin, because it's an appeal. The appeal might be, please empty it. Something about the relationship would be that it's your turn. It's your turn to empty the bin. Or it might be a self-revelation that I am tired of always being the one to notice it. But then the person on the receiving end might hear the bin is full, but also hear an appeal that they want me to stop putting things in it. They might hear something in the relationship that's, oh, I've let her down again. Or they might hear some self-revelation that they're really fed up with me. So you see that this is all a little bit complicated and difficult. I'd be really interested to hear whether any of you can think about yourselves in this, and what kind of communicator are you? I know that I tend to be someone who hears things as an appeal and also as a relationship. So if somebody says the bin is full, I will go and empty it. It might not be what the other person wanted, but that's the kind of person I am. If you're interested in this, I can send you a little questionnaire that can help you find out which ear or which mouth you speak on, or which ear you hear on more likely. But you can see where communication can start getting really messy. How about this one? Here's the information, the factual information. I am here to discuss your children and how we can support you. So let's have a little look at this one. So this is your voice is saying, I am here to discuss your children and how we can support you. So the appeal might be, please engage in conversation with me. Something about the relationship might be that I want to support you because I believe you need it. I think you need me here. And the practitioner's self-revelation might be, I'm worried about your parenting. So they might hear that I'm here to discuss your children and how we can support you as, I think you're a bad parent. This is partly why it is such a minefield conversation. It's very difficult to be conscious of all the different ways that people might interpret or misinterpret what you're saying. So I find this model, it's either called the communication square, or I like to call it 4 aspects of a message, because it is 4 different aspects of a message. Yeah, and that is what people fear, that when we knock on the door, we've already made up our minds that you're a bad parent and you're about to come and you're going to find evidence to take my children away. They might want you to go away. I'm just in this instance, I'm just looking at what they might interpret from us saying, I'm here to discuss your children. But most parents will think they've already been prejudged. And to some degree, that's true, because we don't just come with no information, no reason. We come with a reason. So there is a lot of mistrust in an initial potential mistrust in an initial visit. And we really need to think about, how can we change the message? How can we adjust the message? How can we give the message in a number of different ways? The same message in a number of different ways. How do we take and empathize with the person who we're coming to see? Let's just talk about, how do we actually communicate in that moment? And I'd like to talk about something called non-violent communication. Non-violent communication is a specific approach to communication that allows natural compassion to flourish. It's a powerful method for communicating in a way that meets both parties' needs. And it's a combination of thinking and language. So this is where the developing self-awareness and how we actually communicate comes in. And it can guide us in reframing how we express ourselves and how we hear others. If you think about how we hear others, if someone says to us, no, I don't want to speak to you, how does that impact on us? Where do we go with that? How do we then not become defensive ourselves? It intends to create a quality of connection with other people and oneself that allows compassionate giving to take place. It was designed by this wonderful chap here called Marshall Rosenberg, who died in 2015, and who was a psychologist who got rather fed up with what was going on in America at the time. He was fed up with the way that people needed to be fixed, and he didn't think that actually that was a really helpful way of helping people through communication. He's gone on to be a huge negotiator, international negotiator, as well as helping parents and children and practitioners across the world develop this thing called non-violent or compassionate communication. And he says that he believes every criticism, judgment, diagnosis, and expression of anger is the tragic expression of an unmet need. So he thinks that there are universal human needs that we all share, and that when we are in conflict, it's because of this unmet human need that we're expressing. So what happens in usual processes is that we tend to escalate conflict. We observe a situation, we interpret that, and then we attach feelings to it. And we attach feelings, and then we tend to judge, evaluate, blame, or diagnose. So you need something is a diagnosis. And this can escalate conflict because we're not recognizing the needs of others. So for a little quick story here, there's a woman sitting on a train on a lovely Saturday morning, just like the one that we've had. She's sitting on a train, it's quiet and calm. She's reading her book. There are people around her reading newspapers and quietly chatting to each other. It's all very nice and calm with the sunlight coming through the window. And then the train stops at a station and people get on. And a dad plonks himself down in front of her and looks out the window. His two children are wandering around the train. And as the train moves off, he just carries on staring out the window. And the woman starts looking and noticing the children. The children are running up and down the carriages. They're beginning to annoy those peaceful passengers. They're poking people's newspapers. They're screaming. They're fighting with each other. And the dad continues to look out of the window. What do you think is going on there? I just want to get you into a moment where you're thinking, well, what is the dad doing? Well, the woman, after a while, she gets really fed up and she says, listen, she says, excuse me. And the guy suddenly turns to stare at her and yeah. And she says, your children. And he says, oh God, I'm terrible. We've just come from the hospital. My wife's just died. In the moment that he tells her exactly what's going on for her, all her judgment about this terrible dad who's really not interested in his kids goes away. The children's behavior is exactly the same. His behavior is the same. But the point is that her interpretation has changed. Her feelings have changed. She no longer feels the same way as she did when she was becoming more and more annoyed. So these things happen. We all have these universal human needs. To practice nonviolent communication, we must let go of the goal of getting other people to do what we want. We need to really think about connection, meaning, physical well-being, autonomy, peace, play, honesty. These are all things, these are all universal human needs. We all need them. So the process is to use that observation, but then to sense feelings, to sense your own feelings, but also the feelings in the other person, to sense your own needs, perhaps in that moment, but also the needs of the other person, potentially what they might be, and you can make a request. So to de-escalate conflict, if we can really sit with feelings, we're really on a great path. So when we are in this situation, check your feelings. Check when you feel something, check them. Stop and check. Check your interpretation of what you've seen. Check your own feelings. Sense your own and other people's feelings. Sense and your own and other people's needs. And then you can make a request. When we go into conversations and we fail to see what other people are feeling, we can inadvertently ramp up the conflict in the conversation. So when you can stop and acknowledge and perhaps test out what somebody might be feeling, we can avoid those misinterpretations building upon each other. So finally, the fourth sort of aspect of this is reflection. Reflection is something that some people don't feel that they have enough time to do. I would argue that, in fact, in ethical practice, if we don't make time for doing it, then we're not being professional. So, reflection. Why should we bother? Why should we bother to reflect and prepare? Here's a little quote from a report from Brighton and Hove City Council. They started with a model of relationship-based practice with reflective practice groups some years ago, back in 2014-15. And part of the research that I was involved in came up with this. There was an example of a social worker who said, then me having had the space to reflect and to think and to, look at new strategies, I then went back to the family and I said, we need to do something about this because this is not okay. This hasn't been working and it makes you very anxious. And then the parents both told me, well, you're standing when you come. But I said, you're standing too. How does it make you feel? And he said, you need to sit down, because if you stand, then it makes me feel really anxious. And I know I shouldn't have spoken to you like this. And then he apologized. And I said, okay, so does it make you feel better if I sit? Anyway, so we had that conversation afterwards. And yeah, we were talking on completely different terms now, completely different. And the child remained at home with them. So this is an example of why reflection might just help us to have better conversations. This was a little thing. And this is also related to power. When we don't sit down, when we're standing up, we tend to have a presence, a powerful presence. When we make ourselves smaller, then our power is diminished to some degree. Now, sometimes we need to be standing up because we do need to be in that position. But most of the time when we're having difficult conversations, we want to be thinking about how do we position ourselves? How do we create those conditions, like I was saying, how do we garden that moment to get the most out of it? Well, reflection is about learning. And reflection doesn't have to be very, it doesn't have to be taking huge amounts of your time either. I think the more you do it, the easier it becomes. This is one reflection method. It's a rather quick one, I find. It can help. I find this really helps to do at the end of a visit or at the end of any kind of conversation. And it's called the 4Fs method. It's from Roger Greenaway, and it is facts, feelings, findings, and futures. And I have a little notebook. I would hope that in your kit bag you have a little notebook as well, because actually, what kind of things are you bringing to the conversation? Are you just going to be concentrating on having a two-way conversation, eye to eye? Often it is much more helpful to bring other things along: paper, pens, Play-Doh, balloons, other things, something between you to have as a way of brokering the conversation. So always bring pens, papers. Think about your kit bag, what you've got in there. And in your kit bag, there really ought to be a little notebook for your reflections. Although I think in the 21st century, lots of people enjoy doing that online or typing. I do think there is something in a piece of paper and a pen being held by you. There is something in that process. So this method is a simple one. Facts, what happened, the concrete, specific observations of what happened. The process of reflection is about separating the facts from the feelings. So you want to keep all your feelings out of that first bit, and then describe all the different emotions that you felt in that interaction. And then when you separate the facts and the feelings, read over them and see what you might have learnt. What have you learnt about that situation? What can you do with that in the future? And that's your final 4th F. How will you put that learning into practice? Sometimes you're not really sure. You might need to go and speak to somebody about it. But like that last example from the social worker, one of her learnings was actually that her physical presence made quite a big impact, and that if she sat down, that would help the conversation along. So that's how she put it into her practice. She really thought about her physical presence, and when she stood and when she sat on a chair and when she sat on the ground, on the floor. So think about your positioning as well. But this is not just about where you're sat. This is about a regular practice of trying to get into having really useful conversations with people. So in order to just bring all of this together, the first thing to do is prepare. Always prepare yourself. When you don't prepare, we plan to fail. Fail to plan, plan to fail. So prepare and develop your own self-awareness and contextual awareness about that very specific situation, but also the much broader things in our society. We have a sense that that we need to reward and punish good and bad behaviour in our society. In the social work relationship, we really want to try and get away from that, I would argue. But we want to keep developing our understanding of the different power dynamics that there are. Rosa Parks said that I've learned over the years that when one's mind is made up, this diminishes fear. Part of this preparation is helping you to diminish the fear because you've prepared and you've planned for it. Keep an open mind, mentalize. The second thing to do is prepare the other party, clarify why, what, and how you're going to have this conversation. Make sure that you are prepared as well. Bring along lots of different things that can help the conversation along. Don't just rely on a face-to-face conversation. Bring other things if you're in the same room. Practice and rehearse. Find friends, relations, colleagues to do that with. Sometimes that can really help. And then 3, communicate well and keep centered. Develop your understanding. I've been in social work for well over 30 years now, and I'm always still continuously developing my understandings and my use of communication theories in practice. And I'm developing my own style. So it takes practice. It takes practice to develop these things. If you're interested in developing non-violent communication, I'd really urge that. There are lots and lots of resources online about non-violent communication. And if we can do anything to suspend our judgment, our evaluation, our blame, whether we articulate that or not, then that will really help to have a better conversation, a better relationship, to build up the trust within the relationship so that we can actually help the people that we're designed to help. And then reflect regularly. Sometimes people do that at the end of every day. Sometimes they do that at the end of every week. Sometimes they do that at the end of every session. Don't only reflect on when things go wrong, folks, because reflection is also there to help us to figure out what works well. It's also when we're reflecting with families, use reflection with families, with children, with young people. When we reflect on why things didn't go wrong or why things went so well, it gives us some more armor, more ammunition for things working well in the future. We don't only need to find out what the problems are. We need to find out where the problems aren't. If we were hoping to help somebody to contain a very difficult situation, and let's face it, the social work situations for our client groups now are getting worse. The gap between the rich and the poor has widened significantly. We are yet to feel the negative effects of COVID, although we have felt quite a lot of them already. There are so many negative things going on in the world. It's really important to try and remember that there are some good things, and to focus a little of our time on where those kind of things can help us to figure out where to put the energy and efforts into where the problems are. So don't just reflect on bad things, reflect on good things too. And know that this is about learning and this is about our own development. Thank you. I think everything is possible. Social work is a really tricky job. We didn't come into it to make lots of money, I hope. We came into it to make a difference in people's lives. And we can do that through developing good, trusting, authentic relationships where our communication is underpinned by this sense of being helpful and supportive to all the people that we come into contact with. So that's the end of my little webinar. Thank you so much, everybody.